Stories of Great Christians. From its radio studios in Chicago, the Moody Bible Institute greets its friends everywhere with Chapter 13 in the transcribed story of Peter Marshall, Chaplain of the United States Senate. The story is based on Catherine Marshall's biography, A Man Called Peter, published by the McGraw-Hill Book Company.
Eight months had passed since the honeymoon visit of Peter and myself to Washington, D.C. and the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. This church had called Peter to be its pastor, had insisted again upon his coming, and after months had made it a unanimous call. Only then was Peter certain that this was the will of God for him. He had arranged a 3-month holiday to Scotland for us before taking up his new pastoral duties. But first, there was to be an installation service planned by the church committee. We looked forward to this with something like dread.
Catherine, I'm scared. Just scared to death.
Well, there's no need to be, Peter.
Perhaps I should never have accepted this church. Suppose I can deliver the goods. Suppose they don't like me after all.
Main lobby, right this way, sir. May I take your wrap, miss?
Yes. This is no time to be frightened, Peter. Come on, let's go.
I guess you're right. We're to go to a private room in the dining hall.
Peter.
What's the matter, Catherine?
Look, now I'm frightened.
Why?
It's a formal affair, and I'm not dressed for it.
We're so glad, Mrs. Marshall, that you could stop off on your way to New York.
Yes, we did want you to meet the officers, and, well, I know you'll want to see the manse, too. Incidentally, Colonel Chaplain here will be showing it to you tomorrow.
Oh, thank you.
You understand, Dr. Marshall, we're not making a formal announcement to the newspapers until you're on the high seas.
I appreciate that, Colonel Chaplain.
Say, Doctor, did you know that the first pastor of New York Avenue was a Scotsman?
No, Mr. Eddington, I didn't. But I'm glad you got a Scotsman to get the church started right.
Yes. Dr. Laurie was only 22 when he came to America.
And he was a good covenanter, too, Dr. Marshall. Gave the church a steady diet of Calvinism and the Psalter.
How long ago was that, Colonel?
1803, the year of the Louisiana Purchase.
And don't forget, gentlemen, it was Thomas Jefferson who planted our 4 rows of poplars.
Yes, indeed. I remember my grandfather telling me about Dr. Laurie. The church was too poor to have a building of its own, so it met in the Treasury building. Well, there was a wood-burning stove, and Dr. Laurie himself came early each Sunday morning to start the fire.
You're not insinuating that...
Mrs. Marshall, all these gentlemen can think of are the men in our history. We had some women, too, who were outstanding ministers' wives.
Indeed.
Oh, my, yes. Take Mrs. Radcliffe. She was the woman of Washington in the Victorian era. She sat so erect and queenly in her pew each Sunday morning, an example of decorum to all the believers, particularly the women. She would actually place a hymn book in the small of her back so as to sit up straighter. And such a charming entertainer in the manse, they say.
I guess I'll have a lot to live up to.
My dear, your predecessors were wonderful, and I know you will take your place among them.
You know, of course, that our church is called the Church of the Presidents.
Although more often the Lincoln Church.
Let's see, I think I can name the presidents who worshipped with us. There were 8 of them in all. Let's see, there was Adams, Jackson, Harrison, Polk, Pierce, Johnson. That's 6. Let's see.
And Buchanan.
Yes, of course, Buchanan. And Lincoln, 8 presidents.
Well, it's a very great challenge to me. I hope I shall keep faith with your trust.
I must apologize for the condition of the manse, Mrs. Marshall. It hasn't been occupied in 17 months.
Oh, that's quite all right, Colonel Clephane.
Terribly musty. No ventilation.
How far are we from the church?
About 4 or 5 miles.
It's a lovely neighborhood, Colonel.
Yes, it is. You're right next door to Henry Stimson, you know. That's Woodley, his estate, right over there. Well, you'll want to look around the house, I'm sure. Oh, incidentally, Mrs. Marshall, it needs redecorating, and I brought some wallpaper samples if you'd care to look them over later. Don't be alarmed about the condition of the place, Mrs. Marshall. We'll have it ready for you when you return from Scot.
That will be fine, Colonel.
How large is the manse, Colonel?
10 rooms in all. 6 bedrooms, of course.
6? That'll be 3 bedrooms apiece, Catherine?
Oh, with that music, Peter, there's no mistaking that this is a Scottish ship.
Yes. Catherine, we're going to have a wonderful trip.
I know we are. I'm looking forward to it.
We're going to forget about America for a while. We don't move until September, and we don't begin our work in Washington until October. And, taking the car as we are, we'll see Scotland as no one has ever seen it before.
Oh, you're making this an unforgettable trip for me, Peter.
It is your first trip abroad, isn't it, lass? Steward.
Aye, sir. You called for me?
Steward, you're working on our deck, are you not?
I'm on sea deck, sir.
Aye, that's right. I thought I saw you earlier when we went to our cabins. Tell me, do you still have the same pastry cook aboard as you had 2 years ago?
Aye, and he's a good one.
Well, I ken that. Now, how about bringing us a tray each night, just about bedtime? Say with some samples of pastry and 2 pots of tea. Aye? Perhaps this will help you remember.
Oh, thank you, sir. Aye, you'll have it each night, sir, I promise you. I'll fix it with my own hands.
Peter, you briber. Of all the performances, you'd think you'd found a long-lost brother.
Catherine, don't you know? 2 Scotsmen together are quite enough to start either a Presbyterian church or a war. More tea, Catherine?
You call that tea? It's pure tannic acid.
What? Such insults. That's the way tea should be, my dear. Pastry?
No, thank you, Peter. I'm sorry, but right now I can't stand the sight of it.
Catherine, you're not sick, are you?
Well, I'm not the sailor you are, Peter.
But you can't be sick. Seasickness is a matter of the mind.
I think you're off on your anatomy. Just about 2 feet.
Well, then, let's go outside for some fresh air.
Oh, good. Peter, I think you picked the slowest ship afloat.
Well, there is nothing like a long sea voyage for relaxation.
Ah.
Smell that sea air.
Peter, look. There are lights over there on the horizon.
Aye, there's land.
Land. Oh, it looks wonderful.
That shows you how ill you really are. That's Ireland, Catherine.
Oh, Peter, how can any intelligent man be so prejudiced?
It's not prejudice. My attitude is based on fact.
I suppose your feeling about Scotland's superiority over England is based on fact, too.
Naturally. Englishmen have always outnumbered us by 4 to 1, haven't they? But who's held the empire together? Who's contributed most to her leadership? Now, wait a minute. Let me give the answer. Scotland.
All right, Peter. Say, I'm feeling better. Maybe I will try some of that tea.
Catherine, they're here. Chris and Father Finlay, and there is my mither. They're all here. Ah, what a homecoming this will be.
My first impressions of the British Isles were like those of any American tourist. Everything seemed to be built on a miniature scale. There were no skyscrapers. The otters were tiny and driven on the wrong side of the road, and locomotives looked like toys. The temperature was cold, even in the middle of summer. It took a 3-piece woolen suit plus a couple of sweaters and a fire in the grate to keep one tolerably warm. Colors were unbelievably vivid, and I could see where Peter gained some of his descriptions. I was struck by the large numbers of prams on the streets, the apple-red cheeks of the children, the giant policemen, the bowler hats of the men, and the easy grace with which the women wore their tweeds, and conversely, their clumsy shoes. Yes, there was much to see and to remember.
Aye, and welcome to Inverness. Bonnie Prince Charlie lived here, you ken. In fact, that's the very bed he lay on just before Culloden. It's no for sale at any price. Aye, what a terrible tragedy. They didn't have a chance.
Listen to him, Peter. You'd think the prince was still alive. He's been dead for over 200 years.
Now, Catherine, before you go back to America, I want you to have one of Peter's favorite recipes. This one is for Scotch broth. Now, the night before, you take a pound of Scotch barley and a quarter pound of dried peas and soak together till morn. Next day, first take about a half a pound from the flank of a poor wee sheep, put it into a grand saucepan, cover with water, and boil for an hour. Then you take 3 leeks, 2 carrots, a weak spring cabbage, and chop 'em all up together and put 'em in a pot with the barley and the peas. Don't forget, always stir with a wooden spoon. Ah, that makes a bonny dish. During the second hour, take a wee handful of parsley and chop fine and a carrot of which you grate. After you put these in, let it simmer 15 minutes more. That's all. It's not difficult, and my, it's awful good.
Thinking, Catherine?
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to remember everything we saw.
We saw a lot in 2 months.
Yes. Loch Lomond, Abbotsford, the War Memorial in Edinburgh. So many things. The hotel corridors lined with shoes to be polished. Those giant bathtubs. Peter, I don't think you'd be half the preacher you are if you hadn't been born and raised in Scotland.
Well, I dinna know, girl. Kate, we've dreamed enough. Let's get below and unpack. It's too dark to see anything more. Scotland's behind us, and now before us is Washington.
And so we conclude Chapter 13 in the transcribed story of Peter Marshall, Chaplain of the United States Senate. This story is based on Catherine Marshall's biography, A Man Called Peter, published by the McGraw-Hill Book Company. This is another in the series of Stories of Great Christians, which come to you from the radio studios of the Moody Bible Institute in Chicago.